is your first main topic. So this would be something you might want to define in your notebook, but an index number provides a simple way to compare measurements. Those measurements might be at different times or locations. And those are the two main ideas. It could be for other things as well, but your book just focuses on time periods and locations. Your equation that you're going to see in your book for index number, this will pop up in your homework, and this is straight from your book. An index number will be equal to a value for a particular time period or for a particular location divided by a reference value. And then on the right, they multiply by this times 100. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So for most of your homework, you're going to use an equation that looks something like this. So index number is equal to a value divided by a reference value times 100. We're going to use this and apply this in a few examples, and I think that that will make a little bit more sense when we do that. But all that this is really for, if you want to take a little note, this is just a number that's useful to compare different time periods or different places. So it gives a reference number, or it gives a number compared to a reference number that helps us compare different time periods or different locations. The second equation that I have here, this is for comparing different prices or time locations. So the price, this says dollars sub Y. So this would be the price for a particular year or the price for a particular location. So the price for a particular year in dollars or the price for a particular location in dollars is equal to, you'll notice that I changed the variable here. This would be if you were given a price already of something. So this is equal to the price in dollars for that reference year times the quotient of the indices. And I'm going to talk about CPI more in a minute, but this is just for you to get the equation down, and then we'll work some examples. So CPI for Y over CPI for X. Okay, my purpose of this slide is really for you to get those two equations that I have highlighted down in your notebook. And now what I want you to do right now, when you use this equation, what you're going to have the most trouble with is getting this setup correct. So knowing what goes in the numerator, the denominator. So I'm telling you now, and I want you to put this in your notes. If you'll see it, I put little red circles here at the bottom. So if you have the price of something already, so here it's the price of X. So if you have the price of year X already, then that's being multiplied by the quotient of these indices. The whole purpose of this index is to convert it to the price for Y year. So you need to make sure that you have the price for X divided by the CPI for X. So make sure that this is essentially canceling itself out. We talked about units before, so that's why you always need the CPI for X in the denominator, and that will convert it to the dollars for Y. So now I'm going to break some of this down. I'm going to talk about CPI, and we're going to work some problems that use both of these equations. So this is your main idea. We defined an index number, and I gave you two equations that will come up in this homework. Now let's dig into those a little bit deeper. What is the CPI? The Consumer Price Index, so you will see this in your homework, is a formal way of measuring prices that we pay for different products. So the U.S. Department of Labor sets this up, and what they do is they measure the prices of thousands of goods and services. So milk, eggs, gasoline, basic things that we nearly all, in our culture, purchase weekly or monthly. So thousands of goods and services from 23,000 retail and service businesses. So they also compared prices in different, say, Amazon versus Walmart or Target. The U.S. Department of Labor sets this up. So the CPI is a formal way of measuring prices for our country. It's weighing these items according to how they are used among different families as well. So when you see in your homework CPI, that stands for Consumer Price Index, and I want you to know that's a formal index. When we think about average CPI, so this is a formal index, and we have data on this from years back. So you can see that in this graph right here, I have the average CPI graphed. 100 is typically a reference value. So 100 here is referring to the 1980s for this particular graph. So you would often look for that in a legend somewhere. And then so each of these, this blue line, this blue curve here is comparing all of the different prices to 1980 prices. We would expect 2020, the values would be more, so the index here is higher than it would have been for 1980s. So 1980s, you see that that is referring to 100, whereas 220 is a larger number, 250. So we're going to be working with those numbers today. Whereas in 1920s, we have a much lower number. So here, maybe in the teens. Or 20 at most. So if you're not familiar with it, Consumer Price Index will be an index that this chapter refers to, and it is simply a formal way that the government measures and compares prices and products. You will be using these numbers in the formulas that I showed you right before. So we're going to get to some examples where we practice using the CPIs. Okay, before I get into those examples, I want you to know that this homework focuses a lot on the consumer price index and the cost of living index. And there are many other indices. So I'm going to talk about the cost of living index next. This is not necessarily as formal. So when you hear cost of living index, usually this is denoted or abbreviated COLI, and I'm sorry about my handwriting there, but COLI stands for Cost of Living Index. This is not necessarily as formal. So what I mean by that is a different publication might have a different formula for creating their cost of living, and they might use a different index. So you should always refer to, say, the fine print and read about what they used for their cost of living. So cost of living index is a less formal way of comparing cost of living among cities or locations. And always refer to the fine print or the legends when you read about cost of living index for a different publication, because it isn't a formal tool. But for the cost of living, this is an example. So I think in the notes I have the actual citation or a link for where I got this information. But for the COLI and just some major cities in the United States, this was from last semester when I pulled this up. We would expect, and you can kind of compare these. So Dallas is a little bit, is more affordable. So you have a lower number here. Sometimes indices are given by percentages. On this chart it is. So this is telling me that Dallas is about 97% compared to whatever I think New York is what each of these are compared. I want to say New York, it's not. I may have done this with Arkansas. So let me look at the note a little bit later. But what I want to get at for right now, based on this chart, Dallas is going to be more affordable, and we would expect it to be, than a place like New York City or San Francisco. Those have high indice numbers right now on this chart. And so that is telling us, well, those are more expensive places to live. It might be more expensive to pay rent there. It might be more expensive just to buy groceries. Maybe gas is just way more expensive. So this is a comparison. The cost of living index helps us compare prices and cost of living for different locations. So the consumer price index is more for goods and services. This is your overall cost of living in a location. Okay, I have a one or two more. So this would be for Arkansas. We have a lot of Texans in this class, I remember, but so you might not be familiar with all of these locations, but you'll see Fayetteville shows up here. Arkansas is typically known, like, we could brag about this maybe. Arkansas has a lower cost of living than a lot of most states or most locations in the US. So these are lower numbers than you saw on the last chart, but this would kind of compare cost of living among locations in Arkansas. And you can see a metropolitan area is going to have a higher cost of living than a less populated. There are many, many indices out there, by the way, not just these. These charts are given by percentages. The last two charts I gave you, the one that I gave you with CPI, these are not usually given in percentages. I'm sorry, in percentages. Sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. They still have the same meaning, but the notation is often different. And so that's another reason that I suggest whenever you read about these in a publication, so as you're an adult, if you read about these in the newspaper, look at their fine print and they should have an explanation for what their values refer to, because it isn't a formal index. Sometimes you might have it with numbers in one publication, but with these percentages in another. Also, you might have a different location for the reference value, and you might have slightly different factors that went into the equation. So for instance, cost of living sometimes will include rent prices, as well as goods and services, and then another publication may not use that. It might seem silly, but there's a happiness index even. And this doesn't show up in your homework, but I just wanted to mention there are infinitely many indices that are out there. And so you might be reading the newspaper and discover one that we didn't talk about today. And I just want you to know they don't always look the same. So here for the happiness index, this is comparing according to their formula, so keep that in mind. But this is the World Happiness Report, and if you didn't know this, I didn't make this up. This is legitimate, and this compares the happiness values for different countries according to their formula. So you have to read their fine print and you can go to the World Happiness Report to see what they put into this. But these numbers are not in the hundreds, these are not percentages. And so I want you to know that different indices, they have different reference values and they may appear differently. Those formulas still apply, but just keep an eye out for what their reference values are. So I've shown you 3 indices so far. I've shown you the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. I've shown you the Cost of Living Index, some examples of it, and then I've shown you the Happiness Index. Keep in mind that the World Happiness Report might have a different happiness index than a different publication, and so not all of these are formal indices. The one that is your Consumer Price Index. That's a pretty standard one, and this is done by the government. So keep that in mind. This is a formal one where not all of these are. Okay, for instance, this was just one more slide that I'll discuss because it had a different way of presenting the index. The Mercer 2019 cost of living ranking, so this would be a different publication than the other that I gave you for cost of living. For their particular cost of living index, what went into their formula. These were the 10 most expensive cities, and they presented their cost of living index with this chart that was color coding each of the countries. And so this didn't have numbers, this didn't have percentages. It was presented in this way for you to see the indices, and you can see if the little menu will stay out of the way down there, the indice values for this particular publication were between 21 and 91. They won't always be in the same range of numbers. So keep that in mind. It depends on the publication and the particular index that you're looking at. So if this is your first time to hear about indices, I've shown you a few different examples. If you look online, you can find infinitely many different examples. But